All right, good morning, everyone. Welcome to the 8th episode of SecuriTEA and Crumpets, where we host security professionals each month. I'm delighted today to have Andy Lee on the stream. Andy Lee is a security engineer at Segment. He's interned at companies such as Bouncer and Amazon. He completed a computer science degree at UC Davis. Welcome, Andy. Welcome to the stream.
Thank you for having me, Lewis. Excited to be here today.
Great. So how has your week been so far?
Pretty good. As good as a Monday can be. Yesterday. Today, nothing too crazy has happened yet, but who knows? It's only Tuesday. Plenty of time for anything to happen.
Sounds good. So today, obviously, we're going to talk about the wonderful blog that has been obviously released by a segment. We're definitely going to talk about, what's been happening over on that side about access service and what you've been doing with AWS and GCP. But for now, I want to dig into a bit of your background and talk about, your computer science background that you did at university. Does that sound good?
Yeah.
Okay, so you did a computer science degree at UC Davis. Could you tell me a little bit more about that? Like, what kind of classes did you do? What things you liked about doing a computer science degree? Some of the negative sides of it as well. Do you want to dive into that?
Yeah. Um, there's really just lower division courses, and then there's upper division. So with the lower division, it's kind of things like object-oriented programming, data structures, and then with the upper division, you go into things like algorithms, operating systems, and then computer architecture, and then whatever electives you want to choose. So with that, I think it's really theoretical compared to software engineering. You're really diving into just principles like data structures and algorithms that are like primarily not what you would apply to at your work in most cases. But you do get a lot of exposure to um, that theory, which is kind of really fundamental for building a strong software engineering foundation as well. So what I really found interesting about computer science was the fact that you can iterate really quickly on things. So if you want to tinker around, it's going to be really hard to do that in an engineering major with something like civil engineering, which I actually uh, played around with for a bit. You'd have to go into the lab and go get some steel and try to fabricate that into whatever, right? Like solder it, weld it. But with computer science, you can kind of just go on your laptop and go scrap your entire code base if you wanted to tinker around something. And you can do that all within the same day.
Yeah, that's definitely one of the special benefits when working with code because there's already so much code you can go and take a look at. You can modify existing code. You can't really go and take someone's welding already creation and go and modify that, right? So,
Yeah, exactly.
yeah,
Like you have Git, which lets you just go and spawn another branch and you can go and play with something just like that. So awesome difference there that I really enjoyed.
nice. So I had a very particular question. So you work as a security engineer now, and we'll talk more about your time at Segment later. But did you do any type of security classes at UC Davis? Because from my experience, when I was doing my degree, I did a purely ethical hacking degree. But everyone that I talked to on the computer science majors, they ultimately said like they didn't really do any security. Was that like an elective, or was it kind of just bolted in these days? How does that look?
Yeah, so at UC Davis, there was a security elective. It wasn't a requirement, and I did end up taking that. It was actually one of the last courses I took just due to the timing that it was offered. But when I got into security, it was actually from undergrad research. So that was for mobile device security, which is kind of what got me really engaged in security. And I was really interested in that even before taking the course. But yeah, in terms of just raw course offerings, there isn't really a whole lot. I mean, maybe you could argue that networks are probably related to security, but aside from those two, there isn't too much, I would say.
Got it. Yeah. So I think that's always been a common theme that I've seen, at least from the UK universities. A lot of them tend to focus on like network principles, but when it comes to the AppSec side of things, it kind of really kind of differs. You get some, like I remember they were used to teach PHP, and everything was vulnerable. like the SQL statements had, string concatenation, etc. So it's, in some ways I kind of feel like, do you find like they should have incorporated security type things into the UC Davis modules, or do you feel like as someone who's doing like purely computer science, they need to learn like those fundamentals more over the top of security? Or
Yeah, I think there is room for incorporating a bit more security into just regular coursework. I do remember taking a web development class that was also an elective, and we didn't really cover much with regards to security. And anyone that does web development knows that security is a huge consideration, right? You've got everything from XSS to SQL injection, and these are things that you probably want to expose to students, at least in some capacity early on. And then things like just, yeah, like operating systems. We were obviously working very low level. We were using the C language to go and manipulate things like the buffer and the heap. And maybe it would have been a good idea to introduce what a buffer overflow was, maybe in that course. But or at least mention the idea, not necessarily dive into it too deeply, like a pure security course might.
it's even quite funny because some of the original C books had buffer overflows in some of the examples. So I think what people still learn today obviously still correspond to that, which is quite funny. Yeah, no, I truly, I think we're in the same remit there, that I feel like security should be more incorporated to security classes. We call them modules. We don't really call them classes in the UK. So if I ever interject there, that's fine. So also, during your time at UC Davis, you interned at Amazon. So during your degree, what was the process for you to look for internships? Because there might be people watching the stream, like even now or on YouTube later. Like, what was the process for you, and what kind of helped you obtaining that internship at Amazon?
Yeah, that that's always hard. I think if I were to think about the interview process or just the process of getting an internship, I would just distill it to two things. One is getting an interview, and then two is passing the interview. And I know that sounds like terrible advice, but that's really the two broad categories of what you would have to do. And getting the interview isn't as easy as it sounds for someone with that level of experience. So for me, I didn't get into computer science until sometime during my second year of college. So I didn't really have a very expansive resume. I didn't have a ton of electives or like upper division coursework even under my belt when I was applying for internships for my third year summer. So um, to kind of make up for that, I had try to put some personal projects on my resume, and these are just things that I did with friends and maybe even some classwork to try to make it a little bit more reasonable to hire me. So from there, we had school career fairs. Amazon wasn't at the career fair at the time, but I was able to talk to a lot of other companies like Workday and others that were able to do like just interviews with you later that week. So that's a great way to get in touch with companies and to have that face-to-face interaction that really gives you a bigger chance of getting someone to even review your resume. Because when you go and apply online, it's sometimes very easy to get your resume lost in the stack, so to speak.
Yeah.
And at that point, it's really hard to kind of make a case for yourself, especially if you don't have a lot of experience. So with Amazon, I don't know how they got back to me, but they did. And getting back to me meant that I still had to pass the interview. So most people know that it's probably uh, toward the data structures and algorithms side of things to pass these software engineering interviews. So that's something that I had studied up on at the time, and I would recommend that students do that too. Even though you do learn these concepts in class, you're not really going to be doing many of those problems. And depending on where you're trying to apply, that might not be enough to pass the interview.
Got it. So I have one funny story from from when I applied for an internship, and this is one recommendation I would recommend no one else does. So I applied for a PHP developer role, and I told my friend Scott, who I went to university with at the same time, and he also applied to that position and he ended up getting the job over me. So if I could offer one thing, don't tell your friends about where you're applying, which is the one thing. Yeah, and obviously, having going to like meetups and connections, etc., definitely helped me get into my position. But yeah, definitely that's the number one thing I would say from my own personal experience. But yeah, I think what you said definitely makes sense. If you're applying for a security role, you would want to know about like general security topics, how to use certain security tools, understand basic, fundamentals. If you were going into like a network administration role for like, network protocols, etc. But yeah, definitely always like kind of specialize for what you're applying for, I guess.
Yeah, of course.
So we haven't really talked much about your what you did at Amazon, which I kind of want to dig into. But you also interned at a place called Bouncer. Is that correct? Did I get the name?
Yeah.
Right? Yeah. So you also worked at Bouncer, which was technically a startup. So what was the kind of the contrast between working at Boxer and Amazon, and what other types of things did you do at Amazon that kind of were different to Boxer, for example?
Yeah, so very different, right? Amazon is obviously a huge company with a lot of engineers and very kind of built out processes. And then you've got Bouncer, which at the time was essentially a 5-person company. So very big difference there. I would say that the one thing that I think a lot of people mention when they think about company sizes, the big thing that comes to mind is scope versus impact. So when you have the ability to work at a really large company like Amazon, you're able to really impact a lot of users. You have millions of users using your products, and any small change could actually impact millions or even billions of revenue. Um, and on the flip side, you might not get a lot of scope because when you have that many employees, you tend to want to specialize and get people to do very specific things. So with Bouncer, that was the complete opposite. We didn't have a ton of customers, but because the team was so small, you were able to do a lot as an individual. And that is something that is kind of the theme that I've noticed going from such a big company to such a small company and then going into kind of like a mid-sized company like Segment.
Got it. Obviously, we're not going to talk about the acquisition, but I guess quite a large company now. So
Yeah.
that's interesting. But yeah, so what kind of things did you do in between those roles? What kind of operational type stuff did you do, or like development type stuff?
So both of these were sort of traditional software roles, not necessarily like a security role. But at Amazon, I worked on a debugging tool for a team that was working on media caching. And then at Bouncer, I was working on productionizing a hardware-backed rate limiter that I had helped design as part of my undergrad research. And this is something that we were able to publish to Usenix's 2020 security conference.
I'm just trying to find the link that I had written down somewhere. It's gone. Oh well. Anyway, I'll share it with the stream later. That's okay. So I have another question, and then we'll probably move on to something different. So, as someone who purely did a computer science degree, what do you wish you could have done when starting, and transitioning into a security engineering role? So what are the kind of resources you wish you had known, or like what kind of things you wish you had did like at the kind of base to give you that fundamental kind of principles, for example?
Yeah. So with security engineering, I kind of look at it as like the child of engineering and security. And my background is more in the engineering side. So really lacking much of that security context. I wish I was able to kind of have more of that knowledge going into my role at Segment, and that probably would have come from doing some certifications or exploring more of those. There are certain like courses like that let you hack the box and so forth. Forgetting the name right now. You
Yeah,
can kind of, yeah. doing more like hands-on security work, that would have given me some more preparation for starting my role as a security engineer. But I think the engineering part really comes in handy, and using that to solve security problems is definitely something that is really fun, and also kind of what I was really looking forward to.
Nice. Yeah, I think you actually said the name correct, by the way. So there's like Hack the Box EU. So you basically just said Hack the
Oh,
Box.
okay, yeah.
So technically, technically that was correct. So I put on the stream like your Boxer presentation from Usenix. It actually seems quite interesting. Could you just give like a high level about like what this really was, and then we can move on to what we're the kind of deep stuff we're going to talk about today.
Yeah, so Boxer is the paper that we published, and this is work that I did as an undergrad researcher. But this professor is also one of the founders for Bouncer, which is where I ended up interning after college. Essentially, um, Bouncer is a company working on credit card scanning and detecting fraud. So with Boxer, we essentially came up with different ways to kind of prevent fraud via credit card scanning, and Bouncer is kind of like the productionized version of this research. So a couple components go into this credit card scanning. Like you've got, well, first off, we detect whether a credit card is even being scanned, right? Like if you have someone trying to commit fraud with stolen credit card numbers, chances are they don't have the physical cards. So by just telling someone to scan a card, you're already eliminating a class of bad actors. And second of all, there's components that go into this. So first off, we're checking for the BIN number, which is the bank identification number. And that's just the first 6, I believe, digits of your card to kind of tell you what type of card it is, like what bank it is. So if we know that this is a Chase card, yet our image recognition detects an eagle symbol, maybe that's a mismatch in terms of what we expect the card to be and what the number is suggesting. So there's an object detection, and then there's also a screen detection model, and that's checking whether this card is physically present or whether it's something that's being displayed on a screen. So what I worked on is a rate limiter. So at the end of the day, if we're not really sure whether this card is fraudulent or not, we might just mark someone as a potential fraudster. And if we can rack up enough of these kind of like marks against them, then we might have a decent signal that they are committing fraud. And kind of the big takeaway behind the rate limiter was that it was hardware backed. So if you were committing fraud and we weren't really sure, then we would only cap the amount of fraud that we would let you commit, essentially. And at that point, you'd have to go and buy a new device, which is pretty expensive.
Wow, that's actually really smart because that's going to end up costing them more, and actually it would make it even harder to try and commit the fraud because you don't want to end up having to buy these devices all the time, which is
Exactly. It's not just about stopping all fraud, because that's a really tricky problem.
yeah.
It's more about making fraud so expensive that it's not worth pursuing.
Gotcha. Very cool. Very cool. Okay, so now we're going to move on to. That was actually really. My undergrad project sounds so boring now compared to yours. So that's actually really awesome.
No, it was a really, really awesome professor with a really awesome team of PhD students. Really just kind of got all these ideas working together.
Nice. Yeah, it looked like there was a big band of people that were definitely, involved in this project. So that's really cool. So you should definitely check it out. We posted it in the stream chat. But yeah, you should definitely check it out. So now let's move on to Segment. So obviously we've talked about your internships, at Bouncer and at Amazon. Now you work at Segment. So could you just kind of give like a high level what you do at Segment right now?
Yeah, sure. So I've been at Segment for a bit over a year and a half, and I'm on the product security team. So I work on the security related products, or like the security aspects of our products, and that could be things traditionally like MFA or like SCIM, or even something like a password strength meter. So I've worked on a couple of projects to kind of level up our like internal security posture. Um, Things related to MFA or like asset management, kind of like that, the way we access things, and kind of doing that in a secure manner. And then I've also worked on access service.
And I think that's a good time to interject into access service. So Obviously, recently on June 1st, you released a blog in relation to Access Service. Could you just give like a very high level overview of what Access Service was? And then I have obviously questions around the blog itself. So like around access and so on. So let's just talk about what it is as a high level, and then we'll jump into some of the questions.
Sure. So at a high level, Access Service is an internal web app that lets users request access to different apps or roles that they need. And those requests will be sent to designated approvers. And from there, they can approve those requests. And the nature of these requests is that they're all meant to be temporary access in some way. So you're going to lose it if you don't meet a certain condition.
Got it. So part of the blog, obviously, anytime that you're dealing with any kind of cloud access or dealing with any type of kind of resources that you might want to access, there's this whole concept of, over-permissioned access and under-permissioned access. Can you talk about some of the things that you've seen that might be the common pitfalls that tend to happen when, in relation to over-permission and under-permission?
Yeah. So when you have, let's start with over-provisioned. So this is something more common in really small companies. Like I probably, shouldn't have gotten GCP admin for some cases in
Definitely not.
certain companies. But it's really common to have this because you're really concerned about moving quickly when you're at the stage of a really small company, because yeah, you can't risk your competitor beating you to market, and you don't really have a lot to lose at that point. So it's really important to optimize for efficiency. Um, and then on the flip side, you've got really large companies where maybe it's a real nightmare to actually get access to certain AWS accounts, and it's really kind of the flip side of that coin is you're kind of frustrating developers and creating really tough roadblocks for them to go through. And this makes sense to some degree because with large companies, you have a lot to lose, and you're trying to protect any sensitive information. You might have some compliance regulations that you're trying to abide by. So the pitfalls there, I would say, are if you have under-provisioned access, it's really easy to kind of let that be the norm, and at a later point, have something be exploited due to that over permissioning. And then on the flip side, if you're under provisioning access, you're giving people a really frustrated time trying to get access just to do their jobs.
Got it. The thing that I've noticed more and more, like when I've started to kind of get more involved in cloud, is that, generally people tend to start with very high levels of privilege. So, like if they go into Amazon for the first time, they're going to give themselves administrator privilege because, they don't really understand the whole access, identity access management model. They don't understand how most of the services work, which means like, provisioning in that and like making it like a very slim IAM policy to only access something like, let's say S3, takes time to learn, right? And without, normally that's the way the pitfalls I see is that people tend to give too much permission at the beginning. It's because either the inexperience or ease generally. But I think what you said makes sense because you have two sides of the coin. And obviously when you're trying to like build an MVP and push to market, it's really important to, push fast. And to do that sometimes requires being, a little more risque in the sense of giving access. The same for like when you're like someone, let's just say like Google with GCP, like or like they're shipping products or like and they want to have things locked down because one, they wouldn't want to be breached by their own service, right? So I totally get that, which is very cool. So what would you say, like thinking about over permission, under permission, what would you say is the best middle ground? And maybe this might lead into the access service conversation. What would you say is the best middle ground for provisioning access? For example, that sweet spot, which is not too far and not too far in between. I know that's a very yeah, chicken and egg problem, very hard to answer. But do you have any kind of like thoughts around that?
So I think that's definitely a transition into access service. The way I think about access now is that it's just something that is constantly changing. So when you start on day one, you're gonna get provisioned a set of apps, but that might already be out of date from what you really need and what you actually have. So why is that? It's not because IT teams aren't competent. They're trying to give you the access that they think you'll need based on your role. And they can determine that by looking at roles that other people on your team might have. But the problem with that is that, within even the same person, the access needs are always changing. So by mirroring a teammate's access, you might already be off the mark there with what you have and what you actually need. So I think to answer your question of the middle ground here, it's really just recognizing that access is something that's always changing, and you really want to reduce the friction toward getting access. And that's probably the best middle ground here. And that's really what Access Service aims to solve.
Got it. So I've put on the screen like setting the stage for access at Segment, and I just want to talk about your approach. So obviously Segment, mostly uses Okta for things like federation and being able to like access applications with inside Segment. So obviously what you did with Access Service, or at least the beginning of Access Service, was mapping like Okta roles to AWS roles, right? So could you talk about like some of the challenges and maybe some of the kind of benefits of doing things like this with inside an organization such as Segment?
Yeah, sure. So this is something that actually happened before I joined the company, but to give you an idea of what that kind of unlocked for us, by by using an identity provider to tie into your cloud roles, this is what's called federating your cloud access. By doing this, you're able to take advantage of all the nice things that come with having an identity provider. So in the past, maybe you would go um, log into an AWS account and then provision a user for someone, and then you would have to do that for any AWS account that you have. Um, and that's really cumbersome and really disjoint. So with an identity provider, what you have are these nice apps. We use Okta, so Okta apps linked with AWS roles through SAML, and that gives you a bunch of unlocks, such as you now get MFA, you now get SSO, and all those nice things are packaged in one single source of truth, which is Okta. So by giving someone an Okta app, we no longer have to go through all those hoops before of making someone an AWS user. Now we can just give someone the app on Okta and they'll have access. And then when they leave the company, they're going to get deprovisioned and they'll no longer have access via SSO.
Yeah, that's really smart because obviously, if you did it in the traditional sense of like going into the Amazon console and then, creating a new user and then ultimately getting that user, IAM permissions, every time like they leave the company, you would have to go back into the Amazon, console, you would have to delete that user and so on. But at least now you're doing it at a very more managed area, which is obviously very, already well known to your company. So at the moment, it basically looks like that you have, let's say Okta apps, and they basically map into IAM roles that are then obviously related to accounts with inside AWS. Is that the correct way of thinking of it?
Yeah, something like that.
Yeah.
And that's really important to kind of understand going into Access Service, because when I tell people, yeah, Access Service just adds you to an Okta app or an Okta group. Well, that doesn't really mean much if you're not really using Okta in this way. So just kind of having the background that having an Okta app means that you now have access to single sign-on to an AWS role.
Got it. Now, obviously, let's moving on as well. So you have the ability to map Okta groups to SaaS app groups at Segment. So what does that really mean in the sense of being like in relation to Amazon, for example, or GCP?
Yeah, so not a whole lot. So SaaS apps really are things that people might use Okta a bit more traditionally for. So that might be something like Workday or like apps like Lucidchart. So we're saying that you can also get access to things like that. But I do want to call out in this section that we talk about SCIM. This is something that's done through Okta groups, but SCIM is Center for Cross Domain Identity System, something like that. But what it lets you do is essentially you also introduce an authorization piece to the mix. So not only are you authenticating, you're also authorizing, because SCIM lets you connect your identity provider, in our case Okta, with fine-grained access permissions within whatever SaaS app you're using. So for example, we have Retool, which is an app that lets you kind of make dashboards for internal tools. And we have a couple different access levels within Retool. So by making those into Okta groups, we can use SCIM to just put people straight into those different groups. And you can apply this for any app that supports SCIM.
Got it. That's actually really smart. So you're not just talking about, cloud access, but you're also talking about integrated services, which, sometimes when a new developer or someone from HR, comes into the organization, they might need access to something like Workday, right? So that's kind of like bridging the gap between authorization and also authentication, being able to access resources.
Mm-hmm.
Super cool. Okay, so I think we're going to move on now to talk about Boggs. So part of the blog is talking about Boggs getting bogged down, is how I like to interpret it. But basically, obviously, you integrated things into Okta, into AWS, and like a few of these other things. And obviously, before Access Service came to play, you had this one single point of failure. Now, obviously having one person as the single point of failure obviously is pretty bad, because what if they go on PTO? They can't accept things. What if they're sick? What if they get hit by a bus? I hope that never happens, but who knows? I need to ban someone from the chat. No, want more followers. Obviously having one person to access obviously is quite bad. But the one thing that I noticed, which was the astonishing part of this, is that sorry, I'm trying to find it. Is that at some point it says that only that's what I'm talking about. So only 60% of access. 60% of access was not being used, which obviously is so what was happening at the beginning is that you were getting access to roles and permissions, and obviously this one person that knew a lot about the system would either approve or deny those requests. But only 40% of that access was actually being used, which is kind of obviously, I guess, pretty common for organizations, right? To be honest.
Yeah, possibly.
So sorry, go ahead.
Yeah, I was gonna say it's kind of related to what we were talking about earlier with like the over under provisioning. So maybe people are getting too much or too little access, but the one thing I didn't mention there is that most of the time this access isn't being taken away. So when you get access to something, whether it be a really easy or really hard process to get that access, you actually just have it until the day you leave the company, because most people aren't going back in to kind of audit those things.
Exactly. Now I have a very it's kind of like an interject or intersection into this piece. So often on Twitter, you'll see people mention that like most security incidents or hacks are due to missing basic security practices and also least privilege. As you've spent quite a bit of time now, working on building solutions which attempt to work towards least privilege, how difficult or complex is this for organizations, from your own experience?
Yeah, obviously from this graph we can kind of see that it is pretty difficult to maintain the real least privileged. I think it really depends on what stage a company's at. If you're at an early stage, like there's probably more lower hanging fruit in terms of security. And then when you get on to growing your company, like that's when it becomes more inexcusable that you don't have at least privileged access as something that you care about. So for Segment, this isn't something that we started with. Access Service is only 2 years or so old, and that kind of speaks to the stage at which you might want to consider having least privilege access. So it isn't something trivial, which is why it's not something that people generally want to start with. But after a certain point, you do have to really take that into consideration. And with Segment, that was 2 years ago.
Got it. Awesome. So now let's dive into Access Service. So let's just talk about some of the components. So you obviously mentioned the change from underprivilege overprivilege, and what was the core benefits of moving to Access Service? Because obviously now the whole mentality for Access Service is that you're basically having zero or no time-based permissions anymore. You have basically short-lived access. So could you just talk about Access Service as a general of how it's actually used?
Mm-hmm. Yeah. So to kind of go through that flow there, if you need access to something, you'll go to Access Service, look up the app that you need, and from there you can kind of find that app and request access. So when you request access, and there's a screenshot of this somewhere in the blog, there's a few fields that you'll need to fill in, including what you need access for, who you want to approve your access, and then how long you need access for. So by filling out those few fields, it's going to send a Slack notification to whatever approver you selected. And we use Slack for everything at Segment. So tying in Slack here makes perfect sense. And then from there, someone can go and click approve or deny. And then if you are approved, you'll get another Slack message saying like, hey, like so-and-so has approved your access. Or maybe they denied it because you're requesting access for too long.
Yeah.
So there's two big unlocks here. The first is that you've got this designated approvers by distributing the workload. So we no longer have Boggs being the central point of failure, and we instead have this load balanced approach of sending requests to different people that are really close to the systems.
Got it.
And then, yeah, and then these are the same people that have the most context as to whether you should even get access to whatever you're asking for. Maybe you don't need admin for this particular task that you're describing. Maybe you just need the right role. Maybe you don't need access for a month. Maybe you should reasonably only have it for a week. So these are things that these designated approvers can really answer. And then the second big unlock is this temporary aspect. So there's two types of temporary access that we give. One is this time-based access, and that's when you request access for something like a day, a week, a month. And after that time elapses, you will get your access taken away. So if you need access again at that point, you can go and request it again. But the second type of access, the temporary access that we allow people to request, is called activity-based access. So you can think of this as like a use it or lose it, is like what we like to call it. But how that works is as you use whatever app you've been given, you'll actually automatically extend the expiration date on your access. So, if you use it, if you don't use it, then you lose it. So that's why we call it that. And then, so with the designated approvers plus the temporary access component, these were two huge unlocks for access service.
Yeah, that's actually really awesome because I see multiple benefits for this, right? So you're integrating into basically developer workflow, right? So you're integrating to Slack, you're integrating to like these pull request type things where you've got approvers and define people for people that already have very intricate knowledge of the system. And then you're doing it for various different scenarios where you have time-based access, where you're basically like you need to go in and take a look at some logs for a customer, right? And then you have activity-based stuff where it's kind of like a refresh token per se. Like if we were thinking about a JWT style stuff, where you're basically every time you want to reuse this in a time-based permission, you'll get refresh that token and get access again for an extended period of time. So I think I had a couple of questions around this, and obviously it's really interesting because this obviously must have taken a lot of consideration and security mindset and also like development time to make this really functional. So what were some of the technical challenges of building access service? I know some components were built before you, and obviously there's a bunch of people that are like thanked at the bottom of the blog for building this service. But what else if you've talked to them before, or some of the services you've extended, what would you say were some of the technical challenges around building access service?
Yeah, so access service was built before I joined the company. The first version of it was built by a couple people listed in the blog, and since then I've added a couple features toward access service. I think the challenges with building access service were probably one, to just get people to use the platform. I guess that's not really building, but kind of like a challenge with the platform itself. It's hard to kind of transition people into new processes because once you're used to something, people don't really like to learn new ways to do things. But in terms of technical aspect, we ran into something where kind of it was because access service was so successful that uh, we ended up having a really slow load times because the way that we originally built the system, it was really geared toward just an internal app, a couple requests here and there, no biggie. But as we grew toward kind of like the 2-year mark of using this app company wide, it's really been a problem with load times. So we had to go back in and kind of like rethink how we load requests, how we are organizing the data that's being passed in from the backend. Like we had tons of stuff that wasn't even being used because we're like, oh, it's an internal app. Like we don't really let's make life easier for the developers. Like we don't need to think too far about this. And those decisions made sense at the time for sure, but at this point they were kind of biting us in the foot. So that was definitely something that we had to do that was tricky. Trying to find ways to integrate with IT because, as I mentioned in the blog, just this is something that this type of access provisioning, deprovisioning traditionally falls under the realm of IT, and being able to collaborate with IT on trying to find ways that we can reduce their burden would really unlock their time to have them be able to do more meaningful work. So some of the ways that we did that were making it really easy to add apps into Access Service. So once you make an app in Okta, it doesn't automatically add it into Access Service, but we've created a streamlined way of doing that so that if you want to really take advantage of all these features of Access Service, you could do that pretty easily instead of having to go through a lot of hoops to do that.
That's actually, yeah. So obviously, I think one of the largest kind of restraints in many businesses is the IT organization on how fast they can provision things, how fast they can provide access, make changes to configurations. And if you can streamline their process in a way, I think they're going to love you for it, and probably be able to like elevate the business further from a security presence because they can focus on more critical components to rather than approving 10 access requests a day, right? So that's really cool. I have a few more things that I want to talk about. I just want to kind of talk about the results, which seem really like interesting. So, like for having access to the admin role, for example, there was like a 91.9% reduction, which obviously is super impressive because obviously you do need to have the admin role to perform particular things, but in general, if someone's just accessing an application or accessing a service to do a particular task, obviously they only need a few identity access permissions. Now, my question was, what would you say from your own opinion to access service, and how has it changed the security landscape at? And maybe we've kind of already covered this, but how do you think it's changed the security landscape for like your developers at Segment?
Yeah, I think it's definitely been a big win in terms of both engineering and security. And the reason I say that is because with the security side, usually you get access, you give people new access when they need new things, and that access boundary just kind of keeps growing and growing. But with access service, because you're getting temporary access, it's actually shrinking over time and over the course of like if you're not using access, it's going to shrink. So you're able to kind of make that more manageable and kind of closer in line with what people are actually using. So that's the win for security. And then for engineering, you are able to get access in a much quicker way and a more secure way. So instead of having to go through Boggs or go through IT and then have them make a decision or like route it to a third party that works with the system that they're requesting access for, you can just go straight to the person yourself and have them get a Slack message, right? No need to go through Jira or like a different system that someone isn't as connected to with their day-to-day, and then have that be incorporated into their workflows. So I actually had someone yesterday who asked like, hey, like why isn't this app on Access Service? And that was because it's so much easier to get access through Access Service than it is to get access in more traditional ways. So that's definitely a good sign there that engineers are taking advantage of that.
Yeah, there's also a really cool blog that you all released a while ago where you basically have like that beyond the corporation aspects of like getting access to internal applications, where you basically just everything kind of is accessible on the internet. You just obviously everything is behind these like services such as Okta, which is definitely, I feel, the kind of the correct way of approaching external access into your organization these days. You can set up all these boundaries and walls, but if someone wants to get in, they're going to get in eventually. So it's actually really cool. So the few things that I wanted to talk about before we end the stream is you mentioned in your future work, so things that would improve the service, which were policies and dynamic roles. Could you talk about those two things for a little bit, and like why would they be beneficial to include into something like access service?
Sure. So, as I mentioned, Access Service is growing, and we're getting more and more apps added into Access Service. So, being able to manage that is something that's really important as well. So, right now we have what's called system owners. So, every app on Access Service has an owner to it, and this owner is able to modify that list of approvers. They can add people. Maybe there's new employees that should be approvers. Maybe there are people that no longer work with this system, so they should be taken off the list. Um, and you can customize the apps. But the issue there is that each app is customizable on the app level. So there isn't anything tying apps together. There isn't anything that groups them together into to kind of like common entities. So the idea of a policy would be kind of similar to AWS, where you could say, hey, maybe like I will flag these apps as AWS apps, and then I want to make this policy such that no one can get access for more than a month, or maybe no one can get access for more than a week. So these are kind of examples of doing that. But having some way to like tie multiple apps together and being able to like work with the administrative part of that, that's something that we're really looking forward to as Access Service scales.
That's actually awesome. So I wanted to say like you're doing IAM within IAM, but that's really that's definitely really cool, because if you could do that, then obviously it makes things even more secure, because you already know that these applications, these services are super critical to the business. They shouldn't be exposed for as long as they need to be, and that can just add that extra levels of fine granular activity that you need to be able to like even make something like access service even more scale.
Yeah.
So I didn't mean to interrupt you, but I have one more question, which I think the audience might want to know, and also that I think I would like to know as well. So my final question for you today, Andy, is if someone was to take on building something like access service in their own image, what would you recommend as the core things to think about? So if they had to like build this again from scratch, like let's say, what would you like kind of be the core development principles, or when you're thinking about building this from an architecture perspective, what would you think about? I know that's a very like pinpoint question, but I feel like it might help some of the audience.
Yeah, I think when it comes to building tools for I mean building anything really, you really want to think about your end users. So I would say the one tip would be to build with your users in mind and how they use things, just usability. And what I mean by this is if we look at access service, we're really making the job easier for everyone involved. So the person requesting access, the person approving the access, and the people managing access service itself. We kind of want this because this is ultimately how security works. If your users aren't bought into security, then you don't really have a lot of security. So by making this something really usable, by integrating Slack in as many places as possible, by taking out the piece where you have to go to Jira and do additional steps that you're not familiar with, by kind of making that as simple as possible, we're able to really get buy-in from our users, and but from the approver side and the requester side. And that's something that I would really want to emphasize when building just about anything related to not just security, but just anything in general.
Got it. I think that was sage advice. So I think that's probably a good place to stop. So Andy, I do appreciate all of your time today. This has been a great conversation. Like hopefully anyone who is looking to build something like Access Service takes a lot of inspiration from the blog, and I do appreciate you for releasing it because it's a great resource. Obviously, what you are all doing at Segment is super cool. So I appreciate you being a part of this conversation today.
Thank you for having me, Lewis.
All right, so that was the 8th episode of SecuriTEA and Crumpets. Join us in 2 weeks where we'll have the next episode.